In an unexpected turn, Mark found himself deeply connected to an unusual little creature, a baby bat, that had somehow decided to stick by his side. Instead of being thrown off by the strange bond, Mark leaned into it. He fed the tiny animal bugs and cared for it like it was part of his family. But after nearly a year of this odd but sweet relationship, Mark was completely blindsided by something he never saw coming. Just a week after bringing his new bat friend home, Mark already couldn't imagine life without her. He'd named her Arya and was genuinely surprised by how fun it was to have such a unique pet. He even started to wonder why more people didn't keep bats at home. Still, there was a lot he didn't know about them, and he was starting to realize that. Things took a turn when Arya started slowing down. At first, she was always busy at night, zooming around the house, never sitting still. She even flew a bit during the day sometimes. According to the forums Mark had been browsing, that was a good sign. It meant the bat was adjusting well. But lately, Arya wasn't doing that anymore. She mostly just stayed tucked inside Mark's closet, barely moving and clearly saving her energy. Mark started to worry and thought it might be best to take her to a vet. But that's when he hit his first big obstacle of owning such an unusual pet. And it wasn't a small one. Most of the vets in his area didn't know how to treat a bat, let alone give it a proper checkup. They'd never worked with animals like her before and had no training to fall back on. Mark called around, but most clinics politely declined. A few said they'd try, but only if he signed a form saying they weren't responsible if something went wrong. That didn't exactly make Mark feel any better. He loved Arya too much to risk putting her in the hands of someone who wasn't sure what they were doing. So instead, he went digging online, hoping to find another way to help her. After a long search, Mark finally came across something promising, a bat sanctuary located a few cities away. It would be about a 5-hour drive, and he had no idea if that kind of trip was safe for a bat. But he figured it was worth making a call. Maybe they could at least offer some advice. As he explained Arya's situation to the expert on the phone, Mark began to realize just how serious things might be. One of the first things they told him was that bats really shouldn't be kept as pets at all. In a regular house, it's hard for them to get the space and nutrition they actually need. The bat sanctuary agreed to take a look at Arya and reassured Mark that a long drive wouldn't harm her. They even told him they wouldn't charge anything for the checkup. But there was one condition. If they were able to get Arya healthy again, she wouldn't be coming back with Mark. She'd stay at the sanctuary until she was ready to return to the wild. Just hearing that nearly crushed Mark. Over the past few weeks, he'd grown really attached to her. The idea of letting her go felt awful. Still, he knew deep down it was the right thing to do. If living in his home wasn't good for her, then keeping her would be selfish. Maybe in some quiet way, he'd always sensed that, but hadn't wanted to face it. It only took him a few minutes to make up his mind and call the sanctuary back. He told them he'd bring Arya later that afternoon. Right after hanging up, he got started with preparations. He didn't want to lose a single day. Arya's health was clearly getting worse, and even the expert had said that time mattered now. Mark felt it was the right move. Still, he had no idea what that day would end up bringing with it. He got the back of his car ready, covering the windows to make it dark and giving Arya a little spot to hang from. He packed enough food and water to last the trip, around 5 or 6 hours. While driving, he found himself thinking about how strange and random it all had been. Just 3 weeks ago, fate had dropped Arya into his life. Mark had first come across Arya during a hike in the nearby woods. He'd been walking a familiar trail when he heard some strange rustling in the bushes. At first, he figured it was a small animal, though he couldn't tell what kind. But when he leaned in and pushed the branches aside, something jumped straight at him. For a second, his heart raced. But when he looked down, he realized what had actually happened. A large bat had leapt from the bushes and was now clinging tightly to his arm. The feeling was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Mark didn't know why the bat was even out during the day. He didn't know much about bats, but he was pretty sure they were supposed to sleep during daylight. He tried shaking his arm to get it off, but it didn't budge. Eventually, he figured something must be wrong with it. So, without much of a plan, he decided to bring it home and try to help. Mark couldn't help but be both amused and a little confused by how Arya acted at first. Unlike the nervous, flighty bats he'd read about, she seemed surprisingly at ease in his home. She fluttered around curiously, checking out different spots with a kind of quiet grace. At night, she was the most active, showing off her natural rhythm. Mark often just sat and watched her, amazed by the way she moved, so quick, so aware. Her nightly flights became a kind of show he looked forward to. Wanting to care for her properly, Mark dove headfirst into research. He spent hours reading online, forums, care guides, anything he could find about bats. He learned about what they eat, how they behave, and what kind of space they need. Every bit of new info felt like solving a puzzle. Over time, he went from being totally clueless to someone who actually knew what he was doing. He adjusted his home little by little to make it better for Arya. It wasn't something he'd planned for, but he found himself really embracing it. As days went by, something wordless started growing between them. Arya seemed to notice Mark, responding to his voice and movements. He found these little reactions deeply touching, a flick of her wings, the way she tilted her head when he entered the room. There wasn't a single word spoken, but it meant something. She became a comforting part of his daily life, quietly present through everything, like a quiet friend who was always nearby. Mark would often catch himself reflecting on how peaceful her presence made his home feel. There were no expectations, no pressure, just a calm connection that filled in the quiet spaces of his otherwise busy days. Watching Arya fly around each evening became a kind of gentle routine, a way to wind down. In her, he'd found something special, a companion who didn't ask for anything, but still gave him a kind of comfort he didn't know he needed. At first, when Arya's behavior started changing, Mark didn't think much of it. She began spending more time in her roosting spot, flying less often. He chalked it up to her settling in, maybe getting used to the routine. But then she started seeming more tired, and not just a little. It was hard to ignore. Mark kept trying to tell himself it was fine, but deep down, something didn't feel right. A quiet worry had started to grow. When it was time to get ready for the trip to the sanctuary, Mark didn't cut any corners. He turned the back of his car into a cozy, dark spot for Arya. He packed plenty of bugs and water to make sure she stayed fed and hydrated. He secured her crate carefully, and as he started the car, felt a mix of hope and nerves. During the long drive, Mark's concern kept growing. Arya was quiet, too quiet. She barely moved, and it started to really worry him. Each time he looked in, she opened her eyes and met his gaze. There was still something there, a little spark of recognition. When Mark arrived at the sanctuary, he was met with a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. The staff, clearly experienced with bats, wasted no time taking Arya in for a checkup, but their looks said a lot, like they couldn't quite believe someone had tried keeping a bat as a pet. Mark understood their point, but still, a part of him felt a little defensive. He knew how much he had cared for Arya and how much effort he'd put into keeping her safe. The staff didn't hold back. They peppered Mark with questions about how he found Arya, what she ate, and how he'd been caring for her. There was a hint of doubt in their voices that made him feel uneasy. He explained everything honestly, how Arya had basically chosen him and how he'd done his best to learn what she needed. Even though he meant well, he could tell they were wondering if her current condition had something to do with the way he raised her. Handing Arya over was tougher than Mark expected. He felt both relieved and anxious. On one hand, she was finally getting help from people who knew what they were doing. On the other, there was a heavy ache in his chest as he watched her being carried away. The staff kept things professional, but there was a chill to their attitude, like quiet judgment hung in the air. Mark stood there, worried and uncertain, but deep down he knew this was what Arya needed most. While sitting in the lobby, trying to stay calm, Mark overheard part of a conversation that made his heart skip. A doctor and another staff member were talking quietly, but certain words stood out, never seen anything like it, and very strange. They sounded concerned and surprised. Just catching those few phrases was enough to raise Mark's anxiety. He suddenly felt that Arya's condition might be a lot more serious or complicated than anyone had let on. Unable to ignore what he'd heard, Mark approached the staff again to ask questions. But the answers he got were vague and non-committal. Everything they said felt like it had been rehearsed, carefully avoiding details. The lack of clarity only made things worse. Mark could feel the worry growing inside him. Whatever was going on with Arya, they weren't telling him the full story, and he couldn't understand why. His questions and the worry on his face clearly made the staff uncomfortable. After a few tense moments, they politely but firmly asked him to leave. They explained it was policy and that they needed to focus on Arya's care without distractions. Mark didn't argue, but the whole thing felt off. As the door shut behind him, it hit him. He wasn't just walking away from the building, he was being cut off, both from Arya and the answers he so badly needed. That evening, Mark couldn't stop thinking about Arya. His mind kept circling back to the strange things he'd heard and the way everyone had acted. So, driven by a mix of worry and instinct, he decided to go back. Quietly and carefully, he slipped into the sanctuary again. The halls were dim and quiet, but his determination kept him moving. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for. He just knew something didn't feel right. Staying out of sight, Mark suddenly saw something he never expected. A group of serious-looking people, including a scientist, had arrived in a hurry. They exchanged a few words with the staff before quickly taking Arya, now secured in a travel crate, and heading out. The whole thing was fast, quiet, and clearly important. Mark stood frozen, watching them go, a pit forming in his stomach. What had he just witnessed? And why was it all being done in secret? Mark's heart pounded as he tailed the vehicle carrying Arya. With a mix of panic and determination, he kept a careful distance through the traffic. His thoughts were all over the place: worry for Arya, confusion about what was really going on, and a growing urgency that pushed him to stay close. He didn't know where they were headed, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't afford to lose them. Eventually, the car pulled up to a sleek, remote-looking building that stood out against its quiet surroundings. Mark parked far enough to stay out of sight, his eyes scanning the tall security gates and rows of cameras. It didn't look like an ordinary lab, it looked more like something built to keep secrets. His curiosity spiked, right alongside his nerves. Whatever was going on inside, it was clearly serious. Mark walked toward the front gate, but he was stopped before he could even ask a question. Security was tight, and they weren't interested in his explanations. He tried to stay calm, told them about Arya and how he needed to know what was happening. But no one budged. Every no only made him more certain that something wasn't right. If they wouldn't let him in the front door, he'd find another way. He didn't give up. Mark started calling, emailing, and even messaging on social media, trying to reach anyone who might listen. Eventually, one kind-hearted lab employee responded. They said they'd try to arrange a short meeting with someone inside. Mark felt a rush of relief, but it was mixed with tension. This might be his only shot at getting some real answers. During a short tour of the lab's main hallway, Mark kept his eyes open, soaking in every detail. The place was buzzing with activity. Researchers in white coats walked quickly between rooms, their conversations filled with words he didn't understand. He caught glimpses of machines and tech he'd never seen before. It was clear now, Arya wasn't just any bat. Something about her had drawn serious attention. Mark's gut told him there was more going on than they were saying. In a small, spotless meeting room, Mark sat across from a panel of experts. They talked about Arya, about research, about how unique she was. But everything was vague and wrapped in science speak. It felt like they were dancing around the truth, only giving him bits and pieces. Mark could sense it. They were holding back. Afterward, Mark sat in his car, going over everything they'd said. He played the conversation back in his head, looking for anything they might have slipped. The pieces didn't quite fit, but the one thing that stood out was how invested the lab seemed. They weren't just curious, they were deeply involved. Whatever made Arya special, they weren't ready to talk about it. Mark's frustration grew the more he thought it through. Every answer led to two more questions. Whatever the truth was, it was buried under layers of secrecy. But now, he was more determined than ever to figure it out. He couldn't walk away from this, not when Arya was still at the center of it all. Even with the odds stacked against him, Mark felt his resolve harden. He knew in his gut that something big was going on. Arya wasn't just a sick animal, she was part of something much larger. And whatever that was, the lab was trying hard to keep it under wraps. Mark couldn't ignore that. He owed it to her, to the bond they'd built, to get to the bottom of it. As Mark drove away from the lab, his head spun with possibilities. He couldn't stop thinking about everything he'd seen, and all the questions still left unanswered. What had started as a simple connection between him and a strange little bat had turned into something much bigger. Now it felt like a mission. Mark wasn't going to stop until he knew the truth. After days of pushing and digging, Mark finally got a break. One of his many calls paid off, and he was granted a meeting with a senior researcher at the lab, someone who actually had the authority to explain things. In a plain, windowless room, Mark sat across from the senior researcher. The air felt heavy as he launched into his questions, each one sharper than the last. At first, the researcher was careful with their words, but as the conversation went on, a few guarded facts began to surface. Mark knew he wasn't getting the whole truth yet, but every small reveal felt like a step forward. The researcher admitted that Arya's case was far from ordinary. They mentioned strange biological signs and behavior that didn't match any known patterns. Mark leaned in, trying to take in every word, but just as things got interesting, the answers would stop, held back with vague phrasing and careful pauses. It was clear Arya was unique. What wasn't clear was why they wouldn't just say it outright. The more Mark listened, the more suspicious he became. The half-answers, the careful wording, it all pointed to something bigger. Whatever made Arya special, the lab wasn't ready to let it out. Mark's instincts told him she wasn't just rare, she was part of something important. And the way they were acting only made him more determined to find out what that was. As he walked out of the lab again, Mark's thoughts were spinning. He started putting pieces together, everything the sanctuary had hinted at, combined with what the lab was trying not to say. The full picture was still fuzzy, but it was getting clearer. Arya wasn't just a bat that needed help. She was something much more, and Mark was getting closer to understanding why. Fueled by frustration and clarity, Mark returned to the lab one final time, this time asking directly for the head researcher. He demanded real answers, calmly but firmly. The tension in the room was unmistakable as Mark stood his ground. The head researcher seemed to study him for a moment, then finally nodded, almost as if he'd been waiting for this push. Slowly, the wall of secrecy began to crack. What came next shook Mark. With quiet reluctance, the researcher revealed that Arya wasn't just rare. She was part of a little-known species that had puzzled scientists for years. Her behavior, her biology, none of it matched what they knew about local bats. Her very presence in the area was strange and unexplained. The researcher went further, explaining that Arya's species came from a place still largely unknown. While they didn't go into detail about where exactly, it was clear Arya was far from where she belonged. It finally made sense, why she clung to him, why she acted so differently. Mark now saw her for who she truly was, not just a special animal, but a rare mystery the world barely understood. The lab explained how amazed they were by Arya's ability to survive and adapt so well, especially being so far from her natural environment. Her resilience had caught the attention of researchers, not just because she was rare, but because she had managed to thrive in a place she was never meant to be. Hearing that, Mark felt a deeper respect for her. Arya wasn't just unique, she was a fighter. As Mark left the lab, the weight of what he'd just learned really sank in. Arya wasn't just the little bat he'd come to care for, she was important, a piece of a much bigger picture in the world of wildlife and conservation. It changed how he saw everything, Arya, himself, and the delicate balance of nature that most people never even think about. Back at home, Mark dove into learning more. His living room turned into a mini research center filled with open books and notes. The more he read, the clearer it became. Arya played a role in a system much bigger than either of them. She wasn't just a companion, she was a symbol of something rare and deeply connected to the natural world. But with that understanding came a painful question. Should he keep her, knowing she was safe in his care? Or should he do the hardest thing, let her go, so she could live freely and maybe help her species survive? It wasn't an easy decision, and the thought of parting with Arya made his heart ache. In time, though, Mark came to accept what he already knew deep down. Arya didn't belong in a cage or a closet or even in his arms. She belonged out in the wild, doing what she was meant to do. It hurt, but it was right. And Mark was the only one who could make sure that happened. He spent the next several days getting himself ready. Not just packing or planning, but emotionally preparing to say goodbye. He knew it was coming, and he knew it would be hard, but he also knew it was necessary. Letting go was the most unselfish thing he could do for her. As the release day got closer, Mark's emotions were all over the place. Sadness crept in, knowing how much he would miss her. But underneath it, there was also a quiet pride. He'd helped her heal, given her a chance, and now she had one more step to take. That final visit to Arya's enclosure was the toughest moment of all. Mark stood there, heart heavy, watching her rest. The light caught her wings just right, and for a second he didn't see a pet. He saw the wild right in front of him. Their bond had grown into something special, and it would always mean something. He whispered his thanks for her trust, her strength, and all the quiet moments they'd shared. It was goodbye, but it was also a promise that he'd always carry her story with him. His eyes filled with tears as memories flooded back. The first time they met, the late nights watching her fly, the quiet understanding they shared. Arya had changed his life, and letting her go didn't erase that. If anything, it made it even more meaningful. Mark took a deep breath and stepped back, ready to let her go, not out of weakness, but out of love. It was time. As he left the enclosure, tears still in his eyes, Mark managed a small smile. It hurt, but he knew it was the right thing. Arya was meant to be free, and nothing could ever take away what they had shared. In the days that followed, Mark stayed busy working with the researchers, helping prepare Arya for life in the wild. He saw their dedication and shared in their mission. It made him proud to know he was part of something that mattered. On the night of Arya's release, Mark stood at the edge of the forest. He watched her take off, her wings cutting through the night air. She disappeared into the trees, and just like that, she was home. The wind carried her away, but the memories stayed. Years later, he got word that a colony of Arya's species had successfully settled back into their natural habitat. He smiled quietly, knowing she had made it, and that her story would go on. One clear evening, as Mark looked up at the stars, he felt peace. Somewhere out there, Arya was flying free. And in that moment, he felt their connection again, soft, silent, and still shining. Thanks for following Arya and Mark's journey. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this one. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter.